The fire is already lit. Sit down, breathe, and listen. Carl Jung once wrote, "Madness is sometimes a sane method of reaction to an insane world." Imagine a man sitting alone in his car at 3 a.m. in an empty parking lot. His hands tremble on the steering wheel. He can no longer distinguish between thoughts that are his own and those that seem to come from somewhere else. 6 months ago, everyone saw him as successful, stable, admirable. Today, he whispers to himself and avoids looking in the mirror. What happened? How does someone normal cross that invisible line between sanity and madness? And more importantly, does that line really exist? In this video, you'll discover why Jung believed that so-called madness is not a disease. It's a desperate protest from a soul that has been silenced for years. Why some people fragment not because they are weak, but because they were too strong for too long. But prepare yourself. What you're about to hear might make you rethink everything about sanity, trauma, and healing. Because sometimes the most liberating truth is also the most terrifying. The story I'm going to tell is about James, and perhaps, in some way, it's also about you. Imagine James at 8 years old. Messy hair, curious eyes, always asking why about everything. He built elaborate castles with Lego blocks and invented stories for each figure. Now imagine the house where James grew up, a seemingly normal suburban house, but where silence weighed like lead in the air, where the sound of the key turning in the lock at 6:30 p.m. made the child's stomach contract with fear. James's father didn't always yell. Sometimes he simply looked, a look that turned the entire house to ice. James's mother didn't physically disappear. She was there, cooking, cleaning, but her eyes were elsewhere, as if she had given up existing from within. James learned to read the emotional temperature of each room before entering. He learned that some questions made adults dangerous. He learned that crying was for babies, and that his emotions were too inconvenient to be expressed. Carl Jung said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived life of the parents." James inherited this tragedy, not just in genetics, but in the silence that swallowed his words, in the coldness that froze his feelings. But what really broke James wasn't direct trauma. It was something more subtle, and therefore more destructive. Imagine the scene. James, at 9 years old, runs home from school with a drawing he had made, a superhero who saved sad children. He's radiant, eager to show his creation. But when he arrives home, he finds his parents in a silent argument, one of those that fills the air with tension. He shows the drawing. His mother forces an empty smile and says, "How beautiful, dear," without really looking. His father doesn't even lift his eyes from the newspaper. That night, James hears his parents fighting through the wall. Harsh words, slamming doors, then a silence worse than the screaming. But the next morning, during breakfast, everyone acts as if nothing had happened. "Everything's fine, James. Daddy and Mommy were just talking." This systematic denial of reality became the most lethal poison. Jung called this psychic splitting. When a child is forced to deny their own experience, they learn they cannot trust their own feelings, that their perception is wrong, that they must choose between their internal truth and external approval. And a child always chooses approval, because without it, they have nothing left.
Now imagine James at 16. Tall, athletic, easy smile, captain of the basketball team, excellent grades, popular girlfriend. To everyone watching, he was the perfect American youth. But if you looked carefully, really looked, you'd notice something strange in his eyes. A subtle disconnection, as if he were playing the role of himself. Because that's exactly what was happening. James had become a master in the art of being what others needed him to be. With his parents, he was the obedient son who never caused problems. With teachers, the exemplary student. With friends, the fun guy who always knew what to say. He had developed what Jung called a hypertrophic persona, a social mask so well developed that it had begun to stick to his face. But here's what no one tells you about living with a perfect mask. Underneath it, you're rotting. Imagine James alone in his room, late at night. He looks in the mirror and for a moment, just a moment, doesn't recognize who's looking back. There's a strangeness, as if he were seeing a stranger wearing his face. He shakes his head, smiles at himself, and the feeling passes. But it returns, each time more frequently. Jung wrote that the persona can also exert such fascination over the ego that the person believes they are identical to their persona. James had identified so much with his mask that he had completely forgotten who he was underneath it. And then something interesting happens. The human psyche has a cruel safety mechanism. When the false self becomes unsustainable, it sends warnings. First subtle, unexplained insomnia, a constant feeling of anxiety without apparent reason. James began waking up at 3 a.m. with his heart racing, not knowing why. He began feeling a strange anger when he saw happy couples on the street. He began questioning whether he had ever felt anything real. The warnings were coming.
Imagine James at 28. Engineering graduate, stable job, tidy apartment. By all accounts, he had made it in life. But inside his chest, there was a void that grew like a black hole. Relationships became theater. He knew exactly what to say, when to smile, how to touch, but everything seemed to happen through thick glass. He could see others' emotions, could even imitate them perfectly, but couldn't feel them. Jung said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. For years, James had substituted his real pain with symptoms he could control. When Jessica, his girlfriend of 2 years, said she loved him, James automatically responded, "I love you too." But that night, alone in the bathroom, he caught himself whispering to the mirror, "What is love? How do you know when you're feeling it?" He sought a therapist, sat in the brown leather chair, and said, with his rehearsed smile, "Doctor, I think I have a bit of anxiety. Maybe you could help me with some relaxation techniques?" But underneath the performance, a part of him was screaming, "I don't feel anything. I can't connect with anyone. Sometimes I look in the mirror and it's like seeing a stranger." Jung knew that when trauma is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It hides in the shadows of the psyche, disguises itself, waits patiently. And one day, inevitably, it explodes to the surface. For James, the explosion came on an ordinary Tuesday. Imagine, he's at work in a routine meeting about quarterly budgets. His boss is talking about goals, deadlines, efficiency, and suddenly James hears his own voice, as if coming from far away, saying, "None of this matters, does it? We're all just pretending our lives have meaning." The silence in the room is deafening.
everyone looks at him. James forces a laugh and says he's tired, that he needs more coffee. But something had broken. The mask had cracked, and through that crack, something dark had escaped. That night, James began talking to himself. Not random thoughts, but complete conversations with voices that seemed to come from inside his head. He caught himself arguing with versions of himself, yelling at people who weren't there. Friends began to notice something had changed, but the truth was that nothing had changed. James had just become too exhausted to continue the performance. This is what no one tells you about going crazy. It's not madness. It's the soul giving up on pretending.
Imagine James walking through the streets of his city at 2 a.m. He can no longer sleep, can no longer pretend everything is fine. Every neon light seems to blink a secret message for him. Every conversation he overhears from strangers seems to contain references to his life. He's not hallucinating in the traditional sense. He's interpreting. His mind, deprived of real meaning for so long, is creating connections where they don't exist, desperately searching for patterns that make sense of his pain. When a person spends their entire life suppressing their real feelings, eventually the psyche fractures. Jung compared this to a pressure cooker. When the escape valve is blocked for too long, eventually everything explodes. James began carrying a notebook, writing fragmented phrases that seemed to come from somewhere else. The boy who died at 8 is trying to come back. The masks are melting. Who am I when no one is watching? To others, these were signs of madness. To Jung, they were signs that the psyche was desperately trying to heal itself. Jung called this eruption of the unconscious, when the conscious mind, overloaded by suppression, allows repressed material to surface in chaotic and unprocessed ways. But here's what Jung saw that others didn't. Behind James's apparent madness, there was a deep intelligence trying to express itself. His hallucinations were symbols. His obsessions were attempts by the psyche to process unresolved trauma. James wasn't losing his mind, he was finding his soul, but in a way that society couldn't understand or accept. This is the cruel trick of unresolved trauma. It doesn't leave you alone. It disguises itself as paranoia, depression, even mystical experiences. But behind all of this is a wounded child screaming, "Please see me, hear me, help me make sense of what happened to me." When James was finally hospitalized after being found talking to a tree in the park, explaining to it about the family silence conspiracy, the world saw him as another lost case. But Jung would see James as someone who had finally stopped lying to himself.
Carl Jung spent years studying people like James, those whom society labeled as crazy and abandoned in institutions. And what he discovered was revolutionary. Jung realized that many of these people weren't sick. They were going through what he called forced individuation, a brutal and unchosen process of becoming whole, of facing the dark and denied parts of themselves. Madness is sometimes a sane method of reaction to an insane world, Jung wrote. He knew that often the person who goes crazy is the only one in the environment who is reacting honestly to the insanity around them. Imagine this: James, raised in a family where lying about feelings was survival, where denying reality was the rule, where performing happiness was mandatory. For Jung, James's madness wasn't pathology, it was protest.
It was his psyche screaming, "I refuse to keep pretending. I refuse to live a lie." Jung observed that in ancient cultures, those who went through psychic crises were seen as future shamans, people who had voluntarily descended into the hells of their own psyche, and, if they survived, would return with wisdom to help the community. But in our culture, they are simply medicated, isolated, and forgotten. Jung believed that real healing begins when the unconscious is made conscious, when you stop running from your darkness and decide to look it in the eyes. But he also knew that this process has a devastating price. Imagine James, now 30, sitting in a new therapy, not to adjust or function better, but to finally understand what his madness was trying to tell him. For the first time in his life, he stopped trying to impress someone. He stopped smiling when he didn't feel like it. He stopped pretending he understood emotions he had never really experienced. And when you stop pretending, something terrifying happens. You become vulnerable, completely exposed, like an open wound that needs to be cleaned before it can heal. James began to write, not to organize thoughts or find solutions, but simply to get the pain out of himself. The pages were chaotic, scribbles, repeated phrases, drawings that made no sense to anyone else. But amid the chaos, a phrase emerged, written dozens of times. "I never learned how to exist." That phrase changed everything, not because it brought peace, but because it brought truth. Jung said, "There is no light without shadow, nor psychic wholeness without imperfection. Healing doesn't begin with positive affirmations or willpower. It begins with the brutal courage to admit, I don't know who I am, and that's okay." James began to cry, not polite and controlled tears, but deep sobs that came from a place he had forgotten existed. He cried for the child who learned to silence his own voice, for the teenager who performed happiness for years, for the adult who never allowed himself to be real. He wasn't healed, but for the first time in decades, he was no longer lost. Jung taught that madness was never the enemy. It was an urgent message, a desperate cry from the parts of himself that had been exiled and forgotten. And when James finally opened the door to those parts, they didn't destroy him, they thanked him. Because finally, after a lifetime, someone was listening. True individuation, according to Jung, is not about becoming perfect or normal. It's about becoming whole. And sometimes to become whole, you first need to accept that you are completely fragmented. James learned that his sensitivity wasn't a defect. It was a gift that had been distorted by neglect. His emotional intensity wasn't madness. It was a capacity to feel deeply in a world that teaches you to numb yourself. His paranoia was untrusted intuition. His obsessions were attempts to process experiences that had never been validated. If you've ever felt like you're going crazy, if the world seems too loud and you feel too fragile, Jung would say, you're not broken. You're buried under layers of false identities, others' expectations, and unprocessed traumas. And healing is not about becoming someone new. It's about excavating until you find who you always were, before pain taught you to forget yourself. Jung spent his entire life studying the human psyche, and one of his deepest discoveries was this: our greatest wound often carries our greatest gift. He observed that many of his most disturbed patients were also the most sensitive, the most creative, the most capable of seeing through the social lies that others accepted without question. Dostoevsky,
who intimately knew both genius and madness, wrote, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a great intelligence and a deep heart." He knew that some souls are wounded not because they are flawed, but because they are too sensitive for an insensitive world. Jung saw in this not a pathology, but a sacred calling, the calling to descend into one's own psychic hell, face the demons that live there, and return with something precious, the ability to be present with pain, your own and others, without fleeing. In Greek mythology, Chiron was the wounded centaur who became the greatest healer of his era. His wound never completely healed, but it was exactly this that gave him the wisdom to heal others. Perhaps true madness isn't losing sanity. Perhaps it's pretending that the sanity we have is real, while our soul slowly withers inside, suffocated by masks we never chose to wear. How do you begin to truly heal? Jung would say, start with silence. Not the numbed silence of disconnection, but the courageous silence of finally stopping your flight from yourself. Sit with your pain without trying to fix it immediately. Write without censorship. Cry without shame. Feel anger without judgment. Allow yourself not to know who you are so you can finally discover. And read books that dive into the depths of the human psyche. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson. The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. And Man and His Symbols by Jung himself. These are not self-help books. They are maps to territories you already know intimately, but have learned to avoid. And remember, don't heal to be accepted. Don't heal to be normal. Heal so you can finally be real. So you can look in the mirror and recognize, perhaps for the first time, who is really looking back. Because the world already has too many people living borrowed lives. What the world needs are people like you, who had the courage to descend into the hell of their own psyche and return with wisdom. That night, I understood that James's madness wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of the only story that really mattered, his own. And since then, whenever the world weighs heavy, I return to the fire. See you soon.